Okay, welcome back to those of you who are in the junior seminar this spring of 21. This is the fifth lecture or fifth video I'm recording on this last lecture for the class. And I'm recording this mostly just to resolve and answer some questions. The set of videos that you just watched where I discussed modernism, postmodernism, and romanticism, and then I discussed a whole bunch of contemporary artists. You come in kind of like in mid-story because that video was originally for the art appreciation class for the summer class last summer. So I just wanted to explain a little bit about that as to why they were watching that video. I was using that video to help wrap up the final unit where we were discussing modernism and postmodernism and talking about contemporary art. And what you might not have quite understood was why we started on this page talking about Matthew Barney. And that's because the previous lecture that I did, which was titled The Ideological Impulse, and was all about this question of how much do artists make art where it's about trying to say something about art, and how much of that is a point in art, and how that's a much bigger deal in 20th century and post 20th century art than it was before the 20th century, where really in the 20th century art became a lot about commentary about art. So that's what this image is about. So I started the lecture with this image, trying to get students to think about how do we explain this, how do we understand this, and then we end on the same image where I'm talking about how Matthew Barney's performance piece here, where it's literally about this idea of how every drawing is a um, is a physical manifestation of the restraints on the body or the person who made the drawing, and him literally being in a harness which prevents him from barely reaching the wall that he's doing the drawing on, then defines and changes the drawing, and how much that's a commentary on previous works like Bruce Naumann's piece, Exercise, a Perimeter of a Square. And so that's why we started there, just in case you were a little bit confused, felt like we were just starting out of nowhere. And the other thing I wanted to say about Matthew Barney, we might see him again before I end this video. When I was talking about Matthew Barney there, I was also talking about some of the influences, and for some reason I couldn't call all the artists to mind. I was actually watching that video just the other day, and I was yelling at myself saying, Eva Hess, idiot, you need to say Eva Hess. So besides Bruce Nauman being a major influence on Matthew Barney, I think you could definitely look at his early work as being very much about the influence of Bruce Nauman, the influence of Eva Hess and other sculptors of that group of that period, as well as a major influence of Joseph Beuys, especially in terms of some of the materials that Matthew Barney uses in his physical sculptures. So that was point number one I wanted to make about that. So the other thing I wanted to explain a little bit about was this exercise of the differences between Romanticism, Modernism, and Postmodernism lecture, and this specific kind of thing where I kept showing images from pop culture of various things. And this comes out of an exercise that I used to do in class with the junior seminar, and we would kind of discuss it as I did the lecture, and discuss each kind of section. And it also came when I did this lecture, I would have kind of written definitions of Romanticism and written definitions of modernism and postmodernism already handed out. And part of my point is that the definitions are less important than understanding these things as aesthetics and sensibilities, right? That understanding modernism, or let's say understanding romanticism, you can write a 3-page list of material about what is the definition of romanticism, and then you can find exceptions to every rule that you make, and the same is true with modernism or postmodernism. Being able to really understand it requires understanding it as a sensibility, which then means you understand it's kind of like beyond the definitions. The definitions are important. Understanding, let's say, that a lot of romanticism is about the idea of the artist being an individual who is who is ahead of society, beyond society, and therefore also kind of like in opposition to society. That's important, but you could find lots of examples of romanticism that doesn't quite have that. So, yes, so that was kind of one of the things I wanted to cover about that. And then another thing that came up in the lecture, I'm sorry that this image is kind of fuzzy, but it's a screen capture from my own video, I hate to say. Um, One of the things when we were talking about Pollock, I felt like I left some things hanging because I mentioned about how Pollock is in some ways romantic and in some ways modernist, and even also you could see him almost as proto postmodernist, but I didn't really explain it. So I wanted to explain that because I feel like so I would say that like he's romantic in the sense that the effect of his pieces, like when you're standing in front of them, it's not just me. I mean, like many art historians and art theorists have talked about how his paintings have sort of like a Bierstadt kind of landscape sort of effect of this kind of giant scale space that when you stand in front of them, you feel sort of surrounded by them, and their sense of being having this really deep space in them. Feels kind of like romantic painting. It feels like you're almost overwhelmed by this enormous kind of type of space, and that is somewhat romantic. And then also him as this romantic figure, him being this, like a Bierstadt or like Friedrich Caspar Friedrich. He is this kind of like a romantic figure where he's battling against society's ideas of what is real art and how much just a single artist pursuing his vision will eventually get to something brilliant. That also is very romantic uh, about Pollock. But I think fundamentally, the philosophy of his painting is very modernist. It very much falls into this Greenberg idea of painting should be just about the paint on the surface, just about the idea of a canvas and the marks, and not hiding from anyone the fact that it's just made up of marks of paint on the surface, and that every mark is just a reflection of the gesture. That all comes out of very modernist theory. But then in some ways he's proto postmodernist, and that's because of how much his work puts emphasis on process rather than product. How his work is so much more about the doing the thing. It's the action of the painting, of him making it, that's more important in some ways than any finished product of the painting. So that's wanted to wrap that up. So I really was most proud of these last 2 pages. I feel like these really get you to think the most about what is romanticism, what is modernism, what is postmodernism. I'm not going to go over all of that again, but just wanted to reiterate that point. Now on to the lecture where we looked at various contemporary artists. I'm not going to talk really much about many of these because I think I did a pretty good job talking about them in the previous lecture. You'll notice that they're in a different order because it's the old order. The order I put them in for the art appreciation students was more in chronological order. But I have a few corrections and some other things I wanted to add, such as I added 2 images here on Piero Manzoni. I really like these 2 pieces, and I thought they were worth mentioning. So besides the famous piece of him, or the famous series of pieces where he did various things of the artist, like the breath of the artist, the sweat of the artist, and in this case, the feces of the artist, he also made some other pieces, including these later pieces that he made, including a series of works called Lines of Unusual Length, where he made drawings that were a single line on a scroll of paper. The largest one, I believe, if I remember correctly, was 1.7 kilometers long. And you can make scrolls of really long by just hinging the paper wheat paste glue style, and just making a longer and longer scroll. And the idea was also that these would go into the permanent collections of major museums all over in major cities all over the world, and that if they were all put together, they would actually form the length of the entire circumference of the equator. I'm not sure whether he actually achieved that. I cannot believe that. That is my alarm. And I'm not even halfway done with the stuff I was going to do, talking about, besides talking about Piero Mazzoni, I wanted to also just point out that I see a real strong connection between him and Maurizio Cattelan, who I believe you guys probably talked about before. And I won't even talk about the pedestal of the world piece, which I think is, or the base of the world piece, which is also brilliant. And I pretty much have run out of time. So I'm just going to make